The silent cry, hidden in a child's painting, in the heart of a quiet American suburb, where white fences lined the streets and children's laughter drifted through school hallways. A secret waited to be uncovered. To most, Riverton Elementary was just another safe haven, a place of crayons, art projects, and playground games. But for Officer Daniel Reed and his German Shepherd K9 partner, Shadow, safety was never something to take for granted. That morning seemed ordinary. The click of boots against tile, the easy rhythm of children at their desks. Yet fate shifted when Shadow stopped dead in front of the art room. His ears perked, his body stiffened. Inside, bright canvases decorated the walls. Yet one painting was unlike the rest. It showed a crying girl, her face streaked with painted tears, and a strange symbol hidden in the corner. Most would have dismissed it as a child's doodle. But Daniel knew better. And Shadow, ever watchful, ever loyal, confirmed what the officer's gut already told him. This was no ordinary artwork. It was a cry for help, silent yet desperate. That was the beginning of a journey that would uncover hidden suffering, test loyalty, and show how the quiet courage of a child and the steadfast love of a dog could change everything. The morning bell had already rung at Riverton Elementary, its metallic chime carrying down the neat rows of lockers like a friendly call to order. Outside, the crisp air of early autumn hung over the quiet suburb, sunlight warming the roofs of houses that looked nearly identical, white trim, tidy lawns, flags fluttering on porches. It was the sort of neighborhood people moved to because they believed in safety, in community, in the innocence of childhood. And yet, Daniel Reed knew better. He walked slowly through the main hallway, his boots clicking lightly against the linoleum. At his side padded Shadow, a German Shepherd whose dark coat gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The dog's nails tapped a steady rhythm as he moved, head high, ears flicking at every sound. He was calm but alert, carrying himself with the presence of a sentinel who never truly rested. Children's voices spilled from classrooms, filling the corridor with a kind of warmth Daniel both welcomed and distrusted. There was laughter, the unguarded kind only children seemed able to create. The scratch of pencils echoed behind half-closed doors, mingling with the occasional outburst of excitement when a teacher raised her voice to redirect restless energy. To anyone else, it was a picture of normalcy. But Daniel's eyes scanned each corner with the habitual suspicion of a man who had seen too much to be lulled by peace. The police department had assigned him to conduct a routine security sweep of Riverton Elementary, something the district requested periodically. It was more public relations than enforcement, a way of showing parents that their children were safe. Daniel understood the value of the gesture, but he also knew that evil often wore the mask of familiarity. The places that felt safest were sometimes the ones most vulnerable. Shadow's presence was more than symbolic. The K9 unit had been trained to detect danger in ways Daniel never could. His nose could catch the faintest trace of explosives or narcotics, his instincts often sharper than any officer's intuition. But beyond training, Shadow had something else, a way of sensing unease, of noticing the cracks in the surface before they split wide open. Daniel trusted that unspoken language more than he trusted his own gut. They passed a row of classroom doors, some propped open with rubber wedges, others closed, but humming with the energy of children inside. A few students glanced into the hall as Daniel and Shadow walked by. Their eyes lit up when they saw the German Shepherd, and whispers followed them like ripples. "That's a police dog," one boy murmured, leaning across his desk. A girl giggled, waving shyly when Shadow's head turned in her direction. Shadow didn't break stride. His eyes stayed forward, his movements controlled, as if acknowledging the children would distract him from his duty. Daniel, though, offered a small nod to the teachers. He saw how they straightened, grateful for the sight of law enforcement in their hallways. He understood the silent relief, but he also carried the burden of knowing that their trust was fragile. One incident, one oversight, could shatter it. As he walked, Daniel's mind flickered through memories that never left him. He had responded to calls at schools before. A child gone missing during recess, a stranger lingering near the playground fence, even a lockdown when a parent had shown up furious and out of control. Most ended without tragedy, but the tension never left his chest. He glanced at Shadow. The dog's nose twitched, his pace steady but purposeful. Daniel placed a hand lightly on the leash, though he rarely needed to. Shadow knew his role, as disciplined as any partner Daniel had ever had. The contrast struck him again. The bright chatter of children learning multiplication tables or reading aloud from colorful storybooks versus his own sharpened awareness that danger never announced itself. Parents dropped their children at the curb and drove away, believing the school was a sanctuary. Daniel respected that hope, but he also knew predators counted on that illusion. At the end of the hallway, a mural stretched across the wall, painted handprints in bright colors, each one marked with a child's name. Riverton Elementary, where futures begin, the slogan read. Daniel paused for a moment, looking at it. Futures should begin here, he thought. They should be safe here. Shadow's ears flicked back. His head tilted slightly, catching some sound Daniel hadn't noticed. The officer tensed instinctively, scanning the corridor. But then the dog relaxed, resuming his steady pace. Daniel let the tension drain, though it never fully left him. They turned a corner, their shadows stretching long in the sunlight that filtered through high windows. Somewhere a bell rang again, signaling a class change. The hallway briefly filled with the rush of sneakers and chatter as students shuffled from one room to another. Daniel stepped aside, guiding Shadow close to the wall as children streamed past. Some slowed to look at the dog, eyes wide with admiration. A few reached out tentatively, though Daniel gently shook his head. Shadow remained still, his eyes scanning the crowd, the tip of his tail flicking once before settling again. The noise passed quickly. The hall quieted. The children vanished into classrooms, and silence returned like the slow closing of a door. Daniel breathed in, letting the stillness settle. Routine, he reminded himself. This was routine, and yet he had learned to never dismiss the moments that felt too ordinary. Sometimes it was in those silences that the first hint of danger whispered through. Shadow's head lifted again, ears pricked, gaze sharp. Daniel followed the line of his partner's attention, though for now there was nothing but closed doors and muted voices. He exhaled slowly, resting his hand on Shadow's back. "Let's keep moving," he murmured. The dog's muscles shifted beneath his touch, coiled strength in every step. Together, they moved deeper into Riverton Elementary. One man carrying the weight of experience, and one dog carrying the silent instinct that would soon prove more vital than either of them, yet realized. The laughter of children rang down the hall once more, but to Daniel's ears it carried a shadow, the faint reminder that safety was never guaranteed, and Shadow, ever vigilant, kept walking forward. The hallway stretched quiet ahead of them, just the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the muffled murmur of children's voices drifting through closed doors. Daniel's steps were steady, practiced, the kind of rhythm that came from years of patrol. At his side, Shadow moved with equal precision. Until, suddenly, he didn't. The German shepherd froze. It was so abrupt, Daniel nearly stumbled when the leash drew taut. Shadow's body stiffened, head lifting, ears angled sharply toward the open doorway on their left. A low vibration rose from deep in the dog's chest, the kind of growl that was less sound than warning, primal, instinctive, unshakable. Daniel followed Shadow's gaze. The door bore a simple sign, Art Room, the letters stenciled in cheerful colors. From inside drifted the familiar scents of paint and glue, the faint chemical tang mixed with paper and crayons. Children's laughter spilled out in uneven bursts, broken by the quiet scrape of brushes against canvas. On the surface, it was nothing more than another class, another moment of creativity. But Shadow didn't move. His muscles quivered beneath his dark coat, his paws planted firmly on the linoleum, as though an invisible line had been drawn in front of him. "Easy, boy," Daniel murmured, though his own pulse had picked up. He knew that growl. He had heard it on drug raids, at crime scenes, in alleys where predators waited in the shadows. Shadow never wasted it. He stepped closer, leaning slightly into the doorway. Inside, the room was awash with color. Bright posters of rainbows and shapes covered the walls. Shelves sagged with jars of brushes, and rows of children bent over easels. Their small hands moved in eager strokes, paint smearing across canvases in chaotic but joyful bursts. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. Yet Shadow's gaze was fixed. Not on the children, not on the teacher bustling between them, but on one canvas near the far wall. Daniel squinted, narrowing his eyes to see what had captured the dog's attention. It was a painting like the others, yet utterly unlike them. Most of the children had drawn houses, trees, sunshine beaming across skies of impossible blue. But this canvas showed a figure, a little girl, with tears spilling down her cheeks. The brushstrokes were uneven, almost frantic, as if the painter's small hands had pressed the sorrow directly onto the page. Her eyes, wide and empty, seemed to look out from the paper with a desperation that didn't belong in a child's world. Daniel's chest tightened. He glanced toward the artist. A girl sat at the easel, her head bent, long strands of hair falling across her face. She worked silently, brushing in short, determined strokes, while the other children laughed and chatted around her. Anna. He remembered her name from the teacher's roll call earlier that morning. But it wasn't just the crying figure that sent a chill down Daniel's spine. In the lower corner of the canvas, nearly swallowed by the darker shades of paint, was something else. A mark. Not a random brushstroke, not the accidental smear of color. It was deliberate. A symbol, drawn in lines so fine, it might have been overlooked by anyone not searching for it. Yet Shadow had seen it. The German shepherd's growl deepened, his body leaning ever so slightly forward, as though he wanted to cross the threshold, but waited for Daniel's command. His tail was rigid, his amber eyes locked onto the painting with a focus that seemed almost human. Daniel stepped fully into the doorway. The teacher, Mrs. Collins, looked up with a welcoming smile, clearly pleased by the presence of a uniform. "Officer Reed," she said brightly, "just making your rounds?" He forced a polite nod, masking the unease churning in his gut. "Routine check," he said, his voice even. "Everything okay here?" "Oh, yes," she replied without hesitation. She turned back to the children, praising one for his careful use of color. Daniel's gaze slid again to Anna. She hadn't looked up once since he arrived. While other children had straightened with curiosity at the sight of the police dog, she remained hunched, absorbed in her work, as if shutting out the world. Shadow whined softly, a sharp contrast to his earlier growl. It wasn't fear, Daniel realized. It was insistence. The dog wasn't going to let this pass. He crouched slightly, studying the symbol again. It was subtle, almost hidden in the paint. Two intersecting lines bent at odd angles, a pattern too precise to be accidental. It meant something, though what exactly he couldn't yet say. What he could say was this. The girl had hidden it there on purpose. A secret slipped into the only medium where she thought someone might listen, and Shadow had heard it. Daniel's throat tightened with the weight of that realization. He had seen desperate pleas for help before, but rarely so quiet, so hidden. For a moment he imagined Anna at home, brush in hand, pouring her fear into the only outlet she had. A child's cry for help, disguised as art. The thought chilled him more than any weapon ever could. Shadow shifted closer to him, nudging his leg, his gaze never leaving the canvas. Daniel placed a steady hand on the dog's back, feeling the tremor of restrained energy beneath the thick fur. "Good boy," he whispered, more to himself than to Shadow, because he knew this was no coincidence. He let his eyes move back to Anna. She dipped her brush into the paint, her strokes steady, detached. Around her, the noise of childhood carried on unbroken, as though the world itself had conspired to ignore her silence. But not Shadow, and not Daniel. Something was wrong here. He couldn't name it yet, couldn't point to hard evidence, but he had learned long ago to trust the quiet signals. The things people dismissed as imagination were often the very threads that unraveled into truth. Daniel straightened, his jaw tightening. He would remember this canvas, the symbol, the tears in painted eyes, because whatever secret lay behind it, he and Shadow had just been invited into a story no one else had dared to see. Daniel lingered in the doorway of the art room, longer than he should have, one hand resting on Shadow's harness, as though to steady the both of them. The hum of the classroom continued around him, brushes clinking in water jars, children giggling when a streak of paint wandered too far across a canvas, the steady encouragement of Mrs. Collins as she moved among her students. Normal, ordinary, the kind of scene that should have required no second thought. And yet Daniel's eyes returned again and again to the canvas at the far wall. Anna's canvas. The figure of the crying girl stared back at him, with painted eyes so wide and sorrowful that for an instant it felt as though she might actually be there, standing behind the thin veil of paint. It wasn't the kind of picture a 6-year-old should be creating in a classroom surrounded by rainbows and smiling suns. Children painted joy, imagination, the little worlds that gave them comfort. But this was grief, captured in frantic brushstrokes. And then there was the mark. Daniel crouched slightly, narrowing his gaze on the symbol hidden in the corner of the painting. It was no random doodle, no slip of a distracted hand. The lines intersected at sharp angles, deliberate, intentional, as though they carried meaning. Anna didn't have the words to express. Shadow pressed closer to him, body taut with tension. The dog's ears pricked forward, nose twitching, a faint whine caught in his throat. Daniel laid a steadying hand on Shadow's back, feeling the ripple of muscle beneath fur. It was like touching a bowstring drawn tight, humming with unspent energy. "You see it too, don't you?" Daniel murmured under his breath. Shadow's amber eyes never left the painting. The officer's jaw tightened. He had seen children cry out for help in countless ways. Silent glances, nervous twitches, unexplained bruises. But to see it poured onto a canvas, so raw and so deliberate, struck him deeper than he expected. Anna sat at her easel, shoulders curled inward, her brush moving in small, careful strokes, as if she could disappear into her own work. She hadn't looked up once since he arrived. The other children had stolen glances at Shadow, some whispering excitedly, a few daring smiles in Daniel's direction. But Anna remained locked in her own world, her silence louder than all the chatter around her. Daniel studied her, not just her painting. The way her fingers gripped the brush too tightly, knuckles pale against the wood. The way her hair fell like a curtain across her face, shielding her eyes from view. The way her small body seemed to fold in on itself, as though she were trying to make herself as small, as unnoticeable as possible. Something twisted in Daniel's chest. He had seen this posture before, not in classrooms, but in interviews, in living rooms where the air reeked of neglect, in foster homes where children carried invisible scars. It was the posture of someone who had learned that safety was not a guarantee. Shadow shifted again, the low rumble in his throat barely audible. To anyone else, it might have sounded like nothing. A dog restless in a new place. But Daniel knew the difference. This wasn't restlessness. It was recognition. The symbol. The painting. The girl. Together, they formed a pattern Daniel couldn't ignore. He straightened slowly, his gaze sweeping the room once more. No threat, no immediate danger. Just an art class on an ordinary morning. And yet, beneath the surface something whispered, subtle and insistent, like the first creak of a beam in a house about to collapse. Mrs. Collins appeared at his side, her smile warm but questioning. "Is everything all right, Officer Reed?" Daniel masked the tension in his voice with practiced calm. "Routine check," he said, but his eyes flicked once more to Anna. "Everything looks fine." The teacher nodded, reassured, and moved back to her students. But Daniel's words echoed hollow in his own mind. Fine. It was the word people used when they didn't want to look closer. Fine was the mask children wore because telling the truth was too dangerous. Shadow's gaze hadn't wavered. Daniel stepped back into the hallway, tugging gently on the leash. Shadow hesitated, muscles resisting, before finally following, his head turning back toward the art room, even as his paws carried him forward. Once outside, the door closing behind them, the hallway felt too quiet. The cheerful noise of the art class muffled into silence, leaving Daniel alone with the pounding of his thoughts. He rubbed his thumb against the edge of his badge out of habit, grounding himself in the reality of the moment. He had no hard evidence, nothing to take to the principal or to child services. Just a painting, just a symbol, just the uneasy silence of a little girl who should have been laughing with her classmates. But he trusted Shadow, always, and Shadow had seen something Daniel could not. He slowed his pace, crouching beside the dog, looking into those amber eyes. "Good boy," he whispered. "We'll figure this out." Shadow tilted his head, ears twitching, as though he understood. Daniel stood again, his eyes drifting once more toward the closed door of the art room. The image of the crying girl and the hidden symbol lingered in his mind, sharper than any crime scene photograph. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he knew this much. It wasn't nothing. A seed of suspicion had taken root, and once planted, Daniel knew it never stopped growing until the truth was forced into the light. He exhaled, adjusting the grip on Shadow's leash. The routine sweep of Riverton Elementary had just shifted. This wasn't about patrols or public relations anymore. This was about a girl named Anna, a painting that screamed louder than words, and a German shepherd who refused to look away. Daniel walked on, but the silence pressed heavier with each step. Somewhere behind that door sat a child who had painted her truth in tears, and he wouldn't ignore it. The last of the morning's energy faded as the bell rang, calling students into their classrooms. The hallway emptied quickly, replaced by the muffled hush of voices behind closed doors. Daniel walked with Shadow down the corridor, his thoughts still circling back to Anna's painting, the tears, the symbol, the silence that seemed louder than all the chatter in the room. He stopped outside room 14. The brass plate read, Mrs. Collins, Grade 1. He remembered her face from earlier. Kind eyes, warm smile, the sort of teacher parents felt lucky to have, guiding their children. If anyone could give him more insight into Anna, it was her. Daniel knocked lightly. A moment later, the door opened, and Mrs. Collins stepped out, balancing a stack of papers against her hip. Her expression softened when she saw him, though there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "Officer Reed," she greeted in a hushed voice. "I hope everything's all right." Daniel gave a small nod, gesturing for Shadow to sit. The dog obeyed instantly, lowering to the floor, his watchful eyes still sweeping the hall. "Just part of the routine check," Daniel replied evenly. Then, after a beat, he added, "I was hoping I could ask you about one of your students, Anna Hale." Mrs. Collins's smile faltered, replaced by something more careful. She shifted the papers in her arms, as though suddenly aware of their weight. "Anna," she repeated softly, almost to herself. Daniel caught the subtle hesitation. He'd seen it countless times, in witnesses, in family members, in anyone who carried knowledge they weren't sure they should voice. "Could we step inside?" he asked gently. She nodded, pushing the door open wider to let him enter. The classroom smelled faintly of chalk dust and tempera paint. The desks were neatly arranged in clusters, each one labeled with a child's name in bright marker. On the walls hung projects, alphabet charts, family trees drawn in crayon, math worksheets proudly decorated with gold stars. Mrs. Collins set her stack of papers on her desk, then pulled out a chair, gesturing for Daniel to sit. He remained standing, a habit born of years in uniform, but his stance was easy enough not to seem intimidating. "I don't want to alarm you," he began, keeping his tone low, "but I noticed Anna's artwork in the art room. It stood out. She seems different from the others, withdrawn." Mrs. Collins exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging, as though she had been holding her breath for weeks. She sank into her chair, folding her hands tightly on the desk. "She's always been a quiet girl," the teacher admitted. "From the very first day, Anna preferred to sit alone, to keep to herself. Some children are just shy, and I thought she'd grow out of it." Her voice trembled on the edge of guilt. Daniel stayed silent, letting her speak. He knew the importance of pauses, of giving people the space to let their truths slip free. "But lately, Mrs. Collins continued, eyes fixed on her folded hands, "something's changed. She seems more distant than before. Sometimes I catch her staring off, not even hearing me when I call her name. Other times she trembles, small shakes you might miss if you weren't looking closely. It happens most often on Mondays, after the weekends." Her throat tightened around the last words. Daniel could hear the quiet anguish in her voice, the teacher's gnawing awareness that she had seen signs and done nothing. "I told myself it was nothing," she whispered. "Just nerves or tiredness. Children go through phases." But she trailed off, blinking quickly as if to chase away tears. "The truth is, I should have asked more questions. I should have looked closer." Shadow stirred at Daniel's side, as if sensing the heaviness in the woman's voice. His ears twitched, and he pressed against Daniel's leg in a gesture of quiet grounding. Daniel leaned slightly forward, his tone calm but firm. "Mrs. Collins, don't blame yourself. It's not always easy to see children. They don't always show their struggles in ways adults recognize. But you've noticed enough for me to be concerned." Her eyes lifted to his, wide and full of worry. "Do you think something's wrong at home?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He thought of Anna's painting, the tears, the hidden symbol, the way she hunched in on herself, as though afraid of being seen. He thought of Shadow's growl, his unyielding focus on the canvas. Instinct told him there was more than shyness at play. "I think Anna's telling us something," he said at last. "Not with words, with the only tools she has." Mrs. Collins pressed her hand against her mouth, her guilt etched into every line of her face. "And I missed it." Daniel shook his head. "You saw enough to remember it. That's what matters now." For a moment, the room was quiet, but for the faint tick of the clock on the wall. Outside, the muffled laughter of children at recess floated through an open window, a jarring reminder of how innocence could exist so close to pain. "I'll keep an eye on her," Mrs. Collins said finally, her voice steadier, though her eyes were rimmed with red. "If you think it's necessary, I can start making notes, observations, anything that might help." Daniel nodded. "That would be good. Every detail matters." She hesitated again, then added in a low voice, "I've noticed her father, Marcus, at drop-offs. He doesn't linger, doesn't talk to the other parents, always in a hurry. There's something off about him. I can't explain it, but—" She shook her head, cutting herself short. "I don't want to jump to conclusions." Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't like assumptions, but he trusted instincts, especially from someone who spent her days studying children. Her unease lined up with his own. He rose from his place, Shadow standing fluidly beside him. "You did the right thing by telling me," Daniel said. "We'll follow up. And Mrs. Collins, don't carry the blame alone. These things hide in plain sight for a reason." Her eyes filled again, but this time with gratitude. "Thank you, Officer Reed. I hope she's okay." Daniel gave a small nod, his gaze drifting briefly to the hallway where Anna had walked minutes earlier, her small shoulders hunched beneath the weight of silence. "So do I," he murmured. Shadow's tail flicked once, a silent agreement. As Daniel stepped back into the hallway, the weight of Mrs. Collins's hesitation pressed against him like a warning. He had come for a routine check, but now a darker picture was forming, lines connecting in quiet shadows, pointing toward a little girl's secret pain. And Daniel knew this much. Hesitation had no place here. It was time to look closer. The hum of the classroom lingered even after Daniel stepped back into the hallway. He paused for a moment, hand resting lightly on Shadow's harness, letting the teacher's words echo in his mind. More distant, trembling after weekends, distracted. Signs are easy to dismiss until they form a pattern. And patterns, Daniel knew, were what revealed the truth. He made his way to the main office, the sterile heart of the school. The air there smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, the kind of scent that clung to filing cabinets and years of routine. A secretary sat behind the counter, her glasses perched low on her nose as she typed steadily at her computer. "Officer Reed," she said with a polite smile, recognizing the uniform. "Everything all right?" "Just fine," Daniel replied evenly. I was hoping to take a quick look at the attendance records for one of the students. Anna Hale. Routine follow-up. Her smile faltered slightly, curiosity flickering in her eyes, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned to the file cabinet behind her, rifling through folders until she pulled one free. "Here you go. Sign it out if you need more time." Daniel thanked her and carried the folder to a small table by the window. Shadow settled at his feet, lowering to the tile floor with a heavy sigh, though his ears remained perked, his gaze alert. Daniel opened the folder. The first few pages were ordinary: emergency contacts, addresses, routine health forms. But then he reached the attendance chart. He scanned the neat grid of dates and checkmarks, and immediately something caught his eye. Mondays. There were too many absences clustered at the beginning of the week, not enough to raise automatic alarms, one here, another there, but enough to suggest a pattern. Days when Anna hadn't shown up or had been marked tardy without explanation. He flipped further, reviewing her report cards. Comments from Mrs. Collins stood out in tidy handwriting, bright but withdrawn. Struggles with focus. Incomplete assignments. Daniel leaned back slightly, rubbing his jaw. He thought of the painting in the art room, the trembling hands described by the teacher, the silence that hung over Anna like a veil. One missed assignment meant little, but stacks of them, paired with unexplained absences, painted a different picture. Shadow stirred, letting out a soft whine. Daniel glanced down. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, not in playfulness, but in that restless way he showed when waiting for a command, when his instincts told him something important hovered just beyond reach. "I see it too," Daniel murmured. He pulled a separate sheet from the folder, behavior notes logged by the teacher. Anna is quiet, rarely raises her hand, sometimes appears nervous when called on, often fatigued, nervous, withdrawn. He imagined her walking into class on a Monday morning, shoulders hunched, hair hiding her face, her small voice trapped behind fear. He imagined her painting the crying figure with its hidden symbol, pouring her secrets into the only place they could live safely. The evidence wasn't loud. It didn't scream abuse the way bruises or broken bones did. It whispered. Subtle lines in attendance charts, incomplete assignments, tired eyes that trembled when the world grew too loud. But Daniel had learned to listen to whispers. Sometimes they told the truest stories. He set the papers down and let his gaze drift to the window. Outside, children chased one another across the playground, their shrieks and laughter carried on the wind. The contrast stung. On the surface, every child here should have been free to run, to shout, to stumble into life's small joys. But behind those walls, one girl was unraveling, her truth buried beneath silence. Shadow shifted again, his nose lifting as though catching a scent only he could identify. His ears swiveled, his body tense despite the calm of the office. He didn't relax, not even when a teacher passed by with a clipboard or when the secretary's phone rang briefly. His attention remained locked on Daniel, as if urging him forward. The officer closed the folder slowly, sliding it back into order. He signed his name on the clipboard at the desk, acknowledging the file had been reviewed, then handed it back to the secretary. "All good?" she asked with polite curiosity. Daniel offered a faint smile. "Routine," he said again, though the word felt heavier now. As he walked back into the hallway, Shadow rose instantly to follow, nails tapping against the tile. Daniel's mind replayed the details like a reel of film. Mondays, unfinished assignments, trembling hands, silence that stretched too far. Each thread wove itself into the same dark fabric. Anna wasn't just shy. She was signaling, and Shadow, with his quiet persistence, seemed determined to make sure Daniel didn't ignore it. They paused near the end of the hall. Daniel leaned against the cool wall for a moment, eyes drifting shut, listening to the distant sounds of the school, the buzz of fluorescent lights, the murmur of children, the soft exhale of Shadow beside him. There wasn't enough yet for a report, not enough to justify intervention. But the seed of suspicion had rooted itself deeper, fed now by patterns too precise to be dismissed. He crouched briefly, pressing his hand against Shadow's strong neck. The dog leaned into the touch, steady and sure. "Good boy," Daniel whispered. "We'll keep pulling at this thread." Shadow's ears flicked, his amber eyes steady, as though promising he would. Daniel straightened again, scanning the hallway. The school appeared calm, its walls filled with laughter and lessons, but he knew better. Somewhere behind that calm lived a quiet truth, a child's plea woven into absences, unfinished work, and trembling Mondays. And he intended to find it. The folder in Daniel's hands had already said enough. Absences that fell too neatly on Mondays, unfinished work, notes about trembling hands and distant eyes. Still, he needed more. Patterns meant something, but patterns alone couldn't tell the whole story. He needed to understand the world Anna stepped into when she left these hallways, the place where shadows often grew. Mrs. Collins was still at her desk when Daniel returned to her classroom. The children were bent over worksheets now, their heads bobbing like small boats in a tide of routine. She looked up when he approached, her expression caught somewhere between welcome and unease. "Officer Reed," she said softly, as though even the mention of his title might unsettle the room. "Did you find what you needed?" Daniel leaned against the edge of her desk, careful to keep his voice low. Shadow sat just behind him, the dog's steady presence grounding him. "I noticed some patterns," Daniel replied. "Absences. Incomplete work. You were right to be concerned." Mrs. Collins pressed her lips together, her eyes clouding with a mixture of relief and guilt. "I thought so. But sometimes, you wonder if you're imagining it, if maybe it's just a child's temperament." She hesitated, lowering her voice further. "But Anna, she feels different, like she's carrying something too heavy for a little girl." Daniel studied her face, the way her eyes flicked toward Anna's empty desk. The girl must have been pulled for another activity, and then quickly away again, as if afraid of betraying her. "You've mentioned she's withdrawn," Daniel said carefully. "What about home? Have you noticed anything there?" The question lingered in the air like a weight. "Mrs." Collins shifted in her chair, her hands folding and unfolding atop the desk. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then, finally, she sighed. Her father. The two words carried a quiet heaviness that said more than any long explanation could. Daniel waited, letting the silence pull the rest from her. "Marcus Hale," she said, almost reluctantly. "He drops her off most mornings, always quick, always in a hurry. He never lingers to talk with the other parents. Doesn't attend events, not even the small ones. I've invited him for conferences, but he keeps them short, almost clipped, like he's somewhere else in his head, like he wants to get away as fast as possible." Her gaze lowered to her hands, her fingers twisting together. "I shouldn't speak poorly of a parent, but something about him unsettles me." Shadow stirred at Daniel's side, a soft whine slipping past his muzzle. The dog's body remained poised, his ears tilting forward as though even he understood the shift in tone. "Unsettles you how?" Daniel asked. Mrs. Collins drew a shaky breath. "It's not what he says. It's how he doesn't say anything." The other parents, most of them, stopped to chat, to ask about assignments, to check on their children. Marcus doesn't. He hardly looks at anyone. He drops Anna at the curb, sometimes doesn't even walk her to the door. And when he does, there's this distance. No goodbye, no hug, just a hand on her shoulder, guiding her forward like she's cargo, not his daughter. Her voice cracked at the last word. She looked away, blinking hard. Daniel felt a familiar heaviness coil in his chest. He'd seen this too many times. The parent who didn't want to be seen, who slipped in and out of the schoolyard like a shadow. A parent who avoided connection, who carried secrets too heavy to share. "Have you ever seen anything that made you think she wasn't safe?" He pressed gently. Mrs. Collins hesitated again, then shook her head. "Not directly. No bruises. Nothing I can point to. Just the way she flinches sometimes when you call her name. The way she seems to brace herself for something you can't see." Her eyes lifted to his, wide with a kind of desperation. "Do you know what I mean?" Daniel nodded slowly. He knew exactly what she meant. The body remembered what words couldn't say. Shadow's tail thumped once, sharp against the floor, as though punctuating the moment. Mrs. Collins glanced at him, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If something is happening at home, I don't know how to prove it, and I hate myself for not knowing sooner." Daniel leaned in slightly, his tone firm but quiet. "You're not failing her. You're noticing. That's more than most people do. You saw enough to speak up. That matters." Her eyes glistened, and she nodded, though the guilt didn't fade from her expression. "I just want her to be okay." Daniel let out a slow breath. He thought of Anna's painting again, of the symbol hidden in the corner. He thought of her trembling brushstrokes, of her silence while the room buzzed around her. He thought of a father who never lingered, never spoke, who guided his daughter like baggage and disappeared into the day. The threads were tightening. He straightened, Shadow rising fluidly beside him. "Thank you, Mrs. Collins," he said. "You've given me what I need." She looked up at him, searching his face for reassurance. "And what do you need to do?" Daniel glanced toward the hallway, his jaw tightening. "Find out what waits for her when she goes home." Shadow gave another low whine, as if echoing the thought. Mrs. Collins swallowed, her voice trembling. If you find something, please don't let her slip through the cracks. Children like Anna, they get lost too easily." Daniel held her gaze. "She won't be lost." As he left the classroom, the air in the hallway felt heavier. The laughter and footsteps of children only made the silence inside him grow sharper. He walked with Shadow at his side, his mind already moving beyond the school walls, down the quiet suburban streets where white fences stood like guards, hiding what lay within. It was time to see the world Anna returned to. And Daniel had the sinking certainty that whatever he found there would confirm the truth Shadow already knew. The drive from Riverton Elementary to Anna Hale's neighborhood was only 15 minutes, but to Daniel Reed, it felt longer. He kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on the console beside him. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, his posture as rigid as stone, ears twitching at every passing sound. The dog rarely settled completely during drives, but this time there was a sharper edge to his focus, as though he already sensed where they were headed. Outside, the town unfolded in layers of calm predictability. Suburban streets stretched beneath the golden wash of late afternoon sunlight, lined with identical homes in varying shades of beige and grey. Lawns were cut with military precision. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically in neat arcs, and flower beds bloomed in bursts of careful color. On porches, flags waved lazily in the breeze, the stars and stripes a quiet declaration of small-town pride. It was the kind of place realtors sold with promises of safety and belonging. A place where neighbors borrowed sugar, children played tag until dusk, and families gathered around grills on weekends, picture-perfect, serene. But Daniel had learned long ago that outward perfection was often a mask stretched tight over cracks no one wanted to admit were there. Behind manicured hedges, he had seen families unravel. Behind closed doors, he had seen darkness grow, silent and corrosive. The nicer the street looked, the more it tempted him to search for what lay beneath. Shadow shifted, his nails clicking softly against the floorboard. His amber eyes locked forward, unblinking, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. But Daniel caught the subtle change. The dog's tail stiffened, his ears pricked in sharp focus, his muscles coiled tighter as they turned down the final street. Oak Ridge Lane. It was quiet here, the kind of quiet that felt intentional. Cars sat polished in driveways, not a toy or bicycle out of place. Even the trash cans were lined neatly at the curb, lids snapped shut, no stray wrappers fluttering in the breeze. Daniel slowed the cruiser, his gaze moving from one house to the next. Then Shadow let out a low, guttural rumble. The sound filled the cabin like a warning bell. Daniel followed the dog's gaze, and his eyes landed on a two-story house midway down the block. White picket fence, shutters painted hunter green, a porch swing hanging with a faint creak in the wind. To anyone else, it was as ordinary as the others. But to Shadow, it was something else. His body leaned forward, ears sharp, nose pressed close to the glass, as if trying to breathe in the secrets that clung to that home. Daniel felt the weight of it too. A prickle of unease crawled along his spine, the same sensation he'd felt when he stood in the art room staring at Anna's painting. A sense of something buried just out of sight, waiting to be uncovered. He pulled the cruiser to the curb, cutting the engine. For a moment, he simply sat there, listening. The neighborhood was hushed, the air heavy with the sound of sprinklers hissing and birds calling from distant trees. But beneath it all was silence, the thick kind that carried too much weight. Daniel turned to Shadow. The dog hadn't moved, his entire being focused on the house ahead. A low whine slipped past his muzzle, not of fear, but of insistence, as though he were telling Daniel this was the place, the source, the shadow behind the symbol. "All right, boy," Daniel murmured, his hand brushing over Shadow's strong neck. "We're here." He stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel under his boots sounding too loud in the quiet street. Shadow leapt down beside him, landing with fluid grace, his body immediately angling toward the gate. Daniel paused at the curb, letting his eyes take in the details. The lawn was trimmed, yes, but patches of grass near the fence showed signs of neglect, browning at the edges. A child's bike leaned against the porch, its tires half flat, as though it hadn't been touched in weeks. The curtains in the upstairs window were drawn tightly shut, blocking out the afternoon light. From the outside, it still played the role of a family home. But the subtle flaws spoke louder to Daniel, the tiny cracks where the mask slipped. Shadow pressed against the gate, muscles taut, his breath quickening as he sniffed the air. His ears flicked back once, then forward again. A sign Daniel recognized as unease sharpened into warning. Daniel's jaw tightened. He had walked into countless houses over the years, Mansions and shacks, apartments and farmhouses. The exteriors always tried to tell one story, but the air, the silence, the smallest details told another. And his partner had never been wrong. He reached for the latch, but paused. This wasn't a call backed by paperwork. He had no warrant, no formal complaint. All he had was a painting, a symbol, and the unshakable instincts of a German shepherd who refused to look away. But sometimes, Daniel thought, that was enough. He drew in a slow breath, his eyes still fixed on the quiet house behind the fence. Somewhere inside, Anna Hale lived. Somewhere behind those closed curtains, the story her paintings tried to tell was still unfolding. And Daniel knew, whatever perfection this street wore on its surface, the darkness here was real. Shadow growled again, low and steady, a sound that resonated like a vow. Daniel adjusted his stance, his hand brushing over the badge at his chest. "Let's see what we find, partner," he whispered, and together they stepped toward the gate, leaving behind the illusion of perfection and moving closer to the truth, hidden within. The knock sounded too loud in the quiet of Oak Ridge Lane. Daniel rapped firmly on the front door, his knuckles echoing off the wood, while Shadow sat at his side, still and sharp, ears pricked forward. The afternoon sun had softened into a hazy gold, casting long shadows across the pristine lawns, but at this door, the light seemed to dim. For a long moment, nothing. No footsteps, no voices. Just silence, pressing heavy from within. Then the door creaked open. Marcus Hale filled the frame, though barely. He leaned against the edge, his posture slouched, his hand clutching the doorknob as though he needed it to stay upright. His hair was unkempt, sticking out in unruly patches, and a sheen of stubble covered his jaw. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with exhaustion, or something darker. "Yeah?" His voice was rough, gruff, like gravel underfoot. Daniel straightened, his badge gleaming faintly as the sunlight caught it. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hale. Officer Daniel Reed, Riverton PD. This is my partner, Shadow." He gestured lightly to the German shepherd, who remained seated but tense, his amber eyes locked onto Marcus with unyielding focus. Marcus's gaze flicked down to the dog, then back to Daniel. His lips tightened, his jaw working. "What's this about?" "Routine check," Daniel said evenly. He kept his tone calm, professional, but his eyes took in every detail. The sagging skin beneath Marcus's eyes, the faint tremor in his hand, the way he stood half blocking the doorway as if guarding the house behind him. "I was at Riverton Elementary earlier, wanted to follow up on a few things." Marcus snorted, though the sound carried no humor. "Follow up? With me? Anna's fine. She's a quiet kid, that's all. Always has been." The words came quick, defensive, as though rehearsed. Too quick. Shadow's body shifted, a low rumble beginning in his chest. His ears angled forward, his nose twitching at the air that spilled out from the dim interior. He didn't move closer, but his focus never wavered. Daniel kept his expression neutral. "Teachers mention she's been more withdrawn lately, a little distracted, absent some days." "She's a kid," Marcus snapped, though his eyes darted briefly to the side, avoiding Daniel's gaze. "Kids get sick. Kids get shy. Not everything's a problem." Daniel studied him in silence for a beat, letting the air grow heavier between them. He noticed the faint smell now, the sour bite of whiskey clinging to Marcus's breath, the stale musk of neglect drifting out of the house. The curtains behind him were drawn tight, blocking the light, leaving only a dim, suffocating gloom inside. "You mind if I step in for a minute?" Daniel asked, his tone polite but firm. Marcus stiffened. His shoulders rose, his grip on the doorknob tightened until his knuckles whitened. "No need. Like I said, she's fine." Shadow growled again, louder this time, the sound vibrating through the porch like a warning. Marcus flinched, his eyes snapping back to the dog. "Call him off," he muttered. Daniel didn't move. Shadow's just doing his job. His gaze held steady on Marcus. "Same as me." The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his body angled to block the narrow view inside. "Look, officer, I don't know what you think you're gonna find here. Anna's shy. Yeah, she don't talk much. But that's just her. Always been that way." The words tumbled out sharp and hurried, as if he could wall Daniel out with sheer insistence. But Daniel had heard this tone before, the insistence of someone trying to build walls where the truth was already leaking through the cracks. He tilted his head slightly, keeping his voice low, steady. Sometimes being shy is just being shy, and sometimes it's more. That's what I'm here to figure out. Marcus's nostrils flared. His eyes, bloodshot and restless, flicked from Daniel to Shadow and back again. His jaw worked as though he wanted to argue further, but the words stuck. His defensiveness wasn't anger, it was fear. Shadow rose slowly to his feet, muscles rippling beneath his dark coat. He took one deliberate step forward, silent but unyielding, his eyes boring into Marcus with an intensity that needed no translation. Marcus broke eye contact first. He looked down, muttering, "Fine. You want to come in? Then come in. But you're wasting your time." Daniel gave a curt nod, his hand brushing briefly against Shadow's back in silent reassurance. "Thank you," he said, though his tone was more steel than gratitude. As Marcus stepped aside, Daniel felt the shift in the air immediately. The moment he crossed the threshold, the illusion of the perfect street outside shattered. The air was heavy, thick with the stale scent of liquor and dust. Shadows clung to the corners of the living room, and the neat facade of Oak Ridge Lane no longer reached inside these walls. Shadow's growl faded, replaced by a watchful silence. His head turned slowly, scanning the space, every sense alive. And Daniel knew, whatever Marcus Hale claimed, whatever excuses he offered, the truth wasn't in his words. It was here, in the house itself, and in the silent signals of a child's life. He glanced back at Marcus, who stood stiff in the doorway, his face a mask of tension. "We'll just have a quick look around," Daniel said. Marcus forced a shrug, though his eyes betrayed him, flicking nervously down the hall. "Do what you want." But the way his body tensed, the way Shadow's focus shifted instantly in that same direction, it told Daniel everything. The answers weren't here in the living room. They were waiting deeper inside the house. The moment Daniel crossed the threshold, the illusion of Oak Ridge Lane began to crumble. The bright, perfect exterior, the trimmed lawn, the clean white fence, the neat porch swing, had masked what lay behind the door. Inside, the air was heavy and stale, the faint sting of whiskey cutting through layers of dust and neglect. Marcus Hale stepped aside stiffly, his shoulders hunched as though the act of letting them in had cost him something. "Like I said," he muttered, voice rough and defensive, "you're wasting your time. There's nothing here." Daniel didn't answer right away. He let his eyes sweep the room, cataloging details the way years of training had taught him to. The living room was dim, the curtains drawn tight against the afternoon sun. A thin line of light slipped through a tear in the fabric, cutting across the carpet in a narrow stripe. The coffee table sagged under the weight of clutter. Unopened mail, scattered papers, and 2 half-empty whiskey bottles that caught the weak light, their amber contents glinting dully. One glass sat tipped on its side, a ring of dried liquor staining the wood beneath it. The couch cushions sagged, their fabric worn thin in spots, faint stains blooming across the surface. A pair of shoes lay abandoned near the armrest, one tipped over, its laces tangled in knots. It was a room lived in, yes, but not cared for. Not the kind of mess that came from a busy family. The kind of mess that came from surrender. From someone who had stopped trying. Shadow's nails clicked softly against the hardwood as he moved forward, nose low, tail rigid. His movements were precise, deliberate, as though every shadow might conceal something that needed uncovering. His ears flicked at the faintest sounds. The creak of the floorboards, the whisper of wind against the windows. Marcus noticed the dog's scrutiny and bristled. "Keep him close," he snapped, though the tremor in his voice betrayed more than irritation. Fear threaded through his words. Daniel didn't move his hand from the leash, but he didn't pull Shadow back either. "He's trained," he said evenly. "If there's nothing here, there's nothing to worry about." Marcus muttered something under his breath and dropped heavily into a chair, the wood groaning beneath his weight. He reached for one of the whiskey bottles, then seemed to think better of it, his hand hovering just above the glass before pulling away. His fingers twitched restlessly against his thigh. Daniel took a step further into the room. His eyes tracked the details. The picture frames on the mantel, some turned face down, as though deliberately hidden. The dust along the shelves, untouched for weeks. The faint outline of a handprint on the wall, smaller than an adult's. A child's hand, smudged faintly in grime near the edge of the hallway. The facade of family life was cracking before his eyes. He turned back to Marcus. The man's eyes were bloodshot, his jaw tight. "You said Anna's fine," Daniel said calmly. "That she's just shy." "She is." Marcus shot back quickly, too quickly. "She doesn't like people. Never has. She stays quiet. That's not a crime." "No," Daniel agreed, his tone steady. "It's not. But children don't usually paint pictures like the one I saw today in the art room. They don't hide symbols in the corners, unless they're trying to say something." Marcus's gaze flicked up sharply, then away. His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching along his cheek. "She likes to draw," he muttered. "That's all." Shadow growled, low and steady, the sound vibrating through the stillness of the room. His amber eyes locked on Marcus, unblinking, as though he saw something Daniel couldn't. The man shifted uncomfortably in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck, his gaze darting toward the hallway again. "You cops," he muttered, voice strained. "Always looking for something that isn't there." Daniel ignored the protest. He crouched briefly, running his hand along Shadow's back to settle the growl. The dog quieted, though his body remained taut, his attention fixed on Marcus. "You keep saying there's nothing here," Daniel said softly, his voice calm but edged with steel. "But nothing shouldn't look like this." He gestured lightly at the room, the bottles, the dust, the turned-down frames. Marcus's mouth opened, but no words came. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. For a brief moment, something flickered in his expression. Guilt, maybe, or shame, before he forced it away, his face tightening back into its defensive mask. Daniel let the silence linger. He'd learned that silence could be more powerful than any question. It made people fill the space, reveal themselves in the cracks of their own unease. Marcus shifted again, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. "Anna's shy," he repeated, his voice lower now, almost pleading. That's all. She don't talk to people. Don't mean nothing's wrong. Daniel straightened slowly, his gaze steady. Maybe, he allowed, but shyness doesn't explain absences. It doesn't explain trembling hands. And it doesn't explain symbols hidden in her drawings. The man's face tightened. He opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again, his jaw grinding. Shadow's tail twitched once, sharp against the floor. His eyes never left Marcus. The tension in the room grew heavier, pressing in from every side. The facade of a family home, neat on the outside, broken on the inside, was cracking open. Daniel could feel it. Shadow could sense it. And Marcus Hale knew it too. The house seemed to shrink around Daniel the deeper he stepped inside, the air thickening with each breath. Shadow's nails clicked against the scuffed floorboards, the sharp sound guiding him toward the hallway. Marcus Hale rose quickly, blocking the way. "There's nothing back there," he snapped, his eyes bloodshot, his hand braced against the wall, as if his body alone could hold back the truth. Shadow froze beside Daniel, ears flat, a growl rumbling deep in his chest. Not the sound of uncertainty, but of warning. Daniel's voice was calm, commanding. "Step aside, Mr. Hale." Marcus shook his head violently. "No, that's her room. She's just a kid. Her drawings don't mean anything. You're blowing this out of proportion." Daniel held his gaze. Marcus's eyes flicked toward the closed door at the end of the hall, then back, his throat working in a nervous swallow. The guilt was written across his face. "I'm going in," Daniel said firmly. "You can step aside, or I'll bring a warrant and a team. Either way, that door opens today." After a tense pause, Marcus cursed and stepped back. "Fine. Go look. You'll see there's nothing wrong." The words rang hollow. Daniel walked forward. Shadow stayed close, body taut with purpose. At the door, Daniel paused. The chipped paint near the handle looked as if small fingers had clawed there over time. He turned the knob. The hinges groaned open. Inside, Anna's room was little more than a square box with a bed, a dresser, and a desk. But the walls were covered. Every inch was plastered with drawings, taped one over another like fragments of a story too big for a single page. At first, they looked like a child's play. Crooked houses, stick figures, suns. But beneath the surface lay anguish. Faces twisted in fear, black windows staring out from houses, figures cowering from unseen threats. And the symbols. The same sharp lines Daniel had seen before. Not once or twice, but dozens of times, scattered across the walls like whispers desperate to be heard. Shadow padded inside, nose twitching, his body stiffened, tail rigid, a growl building again. Daniel touched one of the drawings, the paper scarred from the heavy pencil strokes. He could feel the desperation behind them, the silent scream of a child with no voice left. Behind him, Marcus lingered in the doorway, pale and sweating. "They're just drawings," he muttered. "Kids make things up. She's got an imagination, that's all." Daniel turned sharply. "A child draws her world, Mr. Hale, and your daughter's world is crying out for help." The man flinched, his jaw tight. "You don't know what it's like, how hard it's been." Daniel ignored the excuse, studying the room. A stack of unfinished homework lay on the desk. The pillow bore faint stains, as if tears had soaked it nightly. On the dresser sat a cracked photo frame. Anna smiling faintly at a school event, her eyes hollow. Shadow nosed a drawing showing a small figure curled in a corner, dark shapes looming overhead, the symbol carved in the corner again. Daniel crouched, whispering to the dog, She's been telling us all along. Marcus shifted uneasily. You don't understand, he snapped, his voice cracking. She's fine. You're twisting everything. Daniel's tone hardened. Imagination doesn't repeat the same symbols. Imagination doesn't tremble every Monday morning. And imagination doesn't leave a room covered in cries for help. Shadow growled louder, Marcus raising his hands instinctively. Daniel steadied the dog with a touch, his eyes never leaving Marcus. He's reacting to you. Dogs don't lie. Marcus's lips trembled. I didn't mean, it just got out of control sometimes. Daniel pressed. Out of control how? Marcus faltered, his fists clenching. Work dried up. Bills piled on. I lost my job. It was just me and her, and it was too much. Some nights I drank. Some nights His words broke. I never wanted to hurt her. I just snapped. The crack had begun. Daniel's voice cut in, sharp and steady. You had a choice. Every single time. You had a choice. And you chose wrong. Marcus's head jerked up, eyes bloodshot. You think I don't know that? You think I don't wake up hating myself every morning? His voice cracked, anger tangled with shame. Shadow barked once, thunderous, silencing him. Marcus recoiled, back hitting the doorframe. Daniel stepped closer, his shadow stretching over the man. Anna didn't ask for this life either, and those walls prove it's killing her piece by piece. Marcus's shoulders sagged. His whisper was barely audible. I was supposed to protect her, and I failed. Daniel didn't soften. She deserves better than excuses. The silence pressed heavy, filled only by Shadow's low growl, as if the dog himself judged the man. Marcus's voice cracked again. I thought I could stop. Every time I swore it was the last. But it never was. I'd drink, I'd lose control, and she paid the price. Daniel's chest tightened, but his tone stayed firm. Then hear me now. It ends today. You don't get another chance. Marcus crumpled in the doorway, sobbing, his body collapsing under guilt. His words came out broken. I loved her. I swear I did. But the stress, the anger, it ate me alive. Daniel swept a hand toward the walls. This isn't love. This is fear. This is what she thinks home is. Marcus buried his face in his hands, his sobs raw and defeated. Daniel didn't move to comfort him. He turned to Shadow, the shepherd's eyes steady, his breath heavy with restrained fury. We're calling this in, boy. Back up. Now. Shadow sat rigid, his gaze locked on Marcus as Daniel pulled out his phone. His voice into the receiver was clipped, urgent. This is Officer Reed. I need units at 124 Oak Ridge Lane. Immediate. Child in danger. Suspect on site. As the call ended, Daniel looked back at Marcus, trembling and broken. Revulsion flickered in his eyes. Not rage, not hatred, but the truth of a man who could never undo what he had done. The sobs echoed hollow against the walls, but Daniel no longer listened. His focus was already elsewhere, on Anna, on getting her out before another shadow touched her again. Shadow rose, ears pricked toward the hallway, his body coiled with urgency. The mission had shifted, from confession to rescue. Anna's safety was no longer a question. It was the only thing that mattered. The house seemed to hold its breath. Marcus's broken sobs lingered in the doorway as Daniel pushed deeper into the hall. Shadow pressed close at his side. The shepherd's ears flicked, nose twitching, his body tense with purpose. At the end of the hallway stood a closed door. The paint was chipped, the handle smudged with fingerprints too small to be an adult's. Shadow whined softly, urging Daniel forward. Anna? Daniel called gently, his voice more whisper than command. No reply, only the groan of floorboards beneath his boots. He turned the knob. The door opened with a weary creak. The room inside was dim, lit only by a thread of evening light through half-drawn curtains. In the corner sat a child, curled in on herself as if she could disappear. Knees hugged to chest, arms tight, dark hair hiding most of her face, but her eyes, wide, hollow, glassy, met his for a fleeting second. Daniel's chest tightened. No photo, no drawing on her walls could match the raw despair of seeing her alive and afraid. Shadow lowered himself slowly onto the floor, posture calm, breath steady. He didn't move closer, only lay there, a quiet sentinel, patient as stone. Daniel crouched, lowering himself so he wouldn't loom. Hands open, voice soft. "Anna, my name is Daniel. This is Shadow. We came to see you." She pressed harder into the wall, but her eyes flicked to the dog. Shadow stretched out long, head resting on his paws, amber eyes fixed on her with quiet gentleness. His tail brushed once against the floor. "You don't have to be afraid," Daniel said. "Shadow won't let anyone hurt you." Her fingers twitched against her knees. For the first time, her gaze lingered on the shepherd. The rhythm of her breath shifted, just slightly less shallow. Shadow gave a low huff through his nose, almost a sigh. Anna's grip on her knees loosened. One trembling hand slipped free. Daniel didn't move. He nodded toward Shadow. "He's waiting for you. You can touch him if you want." Slowly, painfully slowly, her hands stretched across the space. Fingers brushed his fur. Shadow didn't flinch. He blinked once, slow and steady, then let his tail tap the floor again. Her small hand pressed deeper into his coat. When her eyes lifted toward Daniel, they were still shadowed, but a fragile spark flickered there. "You're safe now," Daniel whispered. "We're taking you out of here." A tear slid down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. From outside, sirens began to rise and fall, weaving through the silence like a promise. Shadow shifted closer, letting her lean against him. The bridge had been built. Down the hall came the scrape of movement. "Marcus." A bottle clattered, his voice muttering broken denials. Daniel didn't look back. "Stay with me, Anna," he whispered, eyes on Shadow. "He's your anchor." Outside, tires crunched, doors slammed. Voices called out, steady, trained. "Riverton PD! Officer Reed!" "In here," Daniel replied, his voice low, not startling the child. Officers filled the hallway. Marcus lunged forward, wild-eyed. "She's fine. You don't take her. She's mine." Shadow rose in a single fluid motion. The growl that poured from him wasn't loud, but deep, shaking the very air. Marcus faltered. "Turn around," an officer ordered. The cuffs snapped shut, final, unyielding. Marcus sagged as they led him out, his protests crumbling. Daniel gave the moment only a glance. Then he turned back fully to Anna. "Good girl," he whispered. "We're going to stand together now. You don't have to let go of Shadow." Her eyes were enormous, her fingers buried in the shepherd's fur. A tiny nod broke loose. Daniel eased closer, offering his arm. She pressed her palm there, testing. Shadow shifted his stance, bracing so she could lean into him. Together, they rose. Step by step, they crossed the hall. Daniel angled his body to block her view of her father being escorted away. Shadow's low rumble silenced Marcus's final attempt at her name. At the front door, the evening air spilled in. Cool, clean, scented with grass and honeysuckle. The sun was setting, painting the street in bands of gold and violet. Anna squinted against the brightness, shrinking back. "You don't have to rush," Daniel murmured, crouching to her level. "One step, just one. Shadow and I will be with you." She hesitated. Then her foot slid forward. Shadow matched her pace, shoulder steady against her hand. Together, they crossed the threshold. Neighbors watched from porches, their whispers faint. Daniel ignored them. This wasn't their story. This was Anna's. Paramedics waited by the ambulance. A woman with kind eyes knelt. "Hi, sweetheart. I'm Mara. May I check your hands?" Anna turned her face into Shadow's neck. The shepherd pressed closer, his steady breathing a shield. Mara didn't push. She waited. Waiting, Daniel thought, was its own skill. Behind them, the cruiser door shut. Marcus's voice frayed into silence, swallowed by the vehicle. "One in custody," a radio confirmed. Daniel's focus stayed with Anna. Her hand opened and closed in Shadow's fur, the tremor easing by degrees. "Would you like Shadow to sit with you in the ambulance?" Daniel asked softly. Her nod was slight, but real. Shadow climbed in first, turning so his eyes stayed on her. She followed, climbing stiffly, then pressing herself against his side. The ambulance hummed with quiet sounds. Velcro, paper, zippers. No shouting, no harsh clatter. The rear doors stayed open, letting the evening air wash through. Shadow stretched across the floor, chin on his paws, anchoring her. Daniel crouched on the step, half in, half out, bridging the world behind and ahead. "Good boy," he whispered to the dog. Shadow's tail tapped once. Anna's fingers finally stilled in his fur. They left the house behind, its white siding and tidy porch disguising years of silence and fear. Anna looked back once, lips trembling. Her eyes lingered on the place that had stolen so much. Shadow nudged her leg gently. She blinked, turned forward, and leaned into him. Daniel opened the car door, crouching low. "This ride isn't about going back," he told her. "It's about moving forward." Shadow leapt inside, tail brushing the seat. Anna followed, burying her hand in his coat. She settled into the seat, small but steady. Daniel closed the door carefully, watching her through the glass. Her eyes still carried shadows, but no longer emptiness alone. There was something new there, fragile, but alive. The car rolled forward. Anna turned her head once, casting one last look at the house. Then she faced forward again, fingers tightening on Shadow's fur. This time, she didn't look back. The patrol car rolled quietly through the streets, Shadow sitting alert beside Anna, his presence a shield against a world she no longer trusted. Daniel drove in silence, his hands steady on the wheel though his thoughts raced. Behind them, the Hale house was left to investigators. Ahead lay something more urgent, Anna's safety and her fragile trust. At the end of a narrow lane, the safe house appeared. Cream walls, green shutters, flowers in the windows. It looked ordinary, but Daniel knew the strength inside it. People trained to listen, to protect, to heal. Anna pressed closer to Shadow as the car stopped. Her knuckles whitened against his harness strap. Daniel didn't speak. Words could wait. The front door opened. A woman stepped out, calm, steady, warm. Sarah, the social worker. She knelt, her eyes level with Anna's. "Hello, sweetheart. My name's Sarah. We're going to help you feel safe here." Anna didn't answer. She clung tighter to Shadow. Daniel opened the door. The shepherd slipped out first, scanning the surroundings before nudging Anna gently. Hesitant, trembling, she followed. Shadow brushed against her leg, guiding her step by step. Inside, the foyer glowed with warm light. Rugs softened the floor. Paintings brightened the walls. But Anna barely looked. Her focus stayed locked on Shadow. "Would you like to see your room?" Sarah asked gently. Silence. Anna froze. Shadow nosed her hand, coaxing the smallest step forward. Daniel caught the motion and knew. Progress measured not in words, but in gestures. Sarah crouched again. "You don't have to talk. Just walk with Shadow." Anna's lips parted, a soft exhale escaping. She let the dog guide her down the hallway. Her room was simple. A twin bed, a dresser, crayons waiting on the desk. Sunlight streamed through pale curtains. Anna hesitated at the doorway, then stepped in. Shadow sat beside her, steady as stone. She sank to the floor, curling small, while the shepherd lay his head across her lap. Daniel exhaled. It wasn't safe yet, but it was a beginning. Afternoon light filtered through the window, striping the floor. Anna sat cross-legged, one hand hovering above Shadow's fur. His tail thumped softly, inviting. Slowly, her fingers pressed into his coat. He leaned into the touch, offering warmth without demand. Her hand moved along his back, each stroke unraveling a thread of tension from her small body. Finally, she leaned her cheek against his side, as if testing whether his steadiness could hold her. He didn't move, just breathed in quiet rhythm. Daniel lingered at the doorway, watching the fragile exchange. Shadow was doing what no adult could, bridging silence, giving safety shape. Minutes stretched. Anna lay down beside the dog, her fingers tangled in his fur, her forehead pressed to his flank, her body softened, her knees uncurled. For the first time, she rested without flinching. Night fell. The safe house quieted, children tucked in, lights dimmed. In Anna's room, shadows stretched across the floor. Curled under a blanket, she drifted uneasily into dreams. Faces blurred, walls shifted, her father's anger loomed. She jerked awake, clutching her knees, breath ragged. The shadow moved instantly. He padded to her bed and pressed his warm body against hers. A soft nudge, a steady breath. "I am here. You are safe." Her hands found his fur, clinging. His exhale vibrated through her fingers. Gradually, her frantic breaths slowed to match his rhythm. From a desk in the corner, Daniel watched. He'd seen children like her before, fear that lingered long after escape. But Shadow's instincts surpassed training. He didn't reason, he didn't explain. He simply was. Anna whispered then, her first word since arriving. "Shadow." Barely audible, but real. His ears twitched, his eyes lifted, steady and kind. Daniel's throat tightened. The first night was always the hardest, but Shadow had given her something words couldn't. Presence. Hours passed. Anna's small hand remained tangled in Shadow's coat. The nightmares came and went, but each time his nudge steadied her. By midnight, she leaned fully against him, her breathing even. For the first time in years, she slept without waking in terror. Daniel stood at the doorway, watching the tableau. A child reclaiming safety, a dog guarding her peace. He thought of other cases, of children never reached in time. Tonight was different. Tonight, one had been saved. Outside, the safe house hummed softly. Distant footsteps, muffled laughter, life continuing. Inside Anna's room, the world was reduced to two steady rhythms, the breath of a child and the breath of a dog. By dawn, pale light brushed through the curtains. Anna stirred, but her body remained relaxed. Shadow was still there, head on his paws, eyes half-lidded, keeping watch. For the first night in an eternity, fear had loosened its grip. In its place, fragile but real, was trust. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above the interrogation room, their harsh glow cutting across the sterile walls. Marcus Hale sat rigid in his chair, hands cuffed, sweat sliding down his temple. He had been in rooms like this before, but tonight felt different. Heavier, colder. The door opened. Daniel entered, steady, deliberate. Shadow padded in behind him, paws silent on the linoleum. The shepherd's amber eyes fixed on Marcus with an unblinking stare. Marcus flinched. The dog didn't move, didn't growl, yet his presence radiated authority, a silent warning that nothing would go unseen. Daniel leaned on the table, eyes calm but unyielding. Marcus, we need the truth. Start talking. Marcus shook his head, words tumbling fast and brittle. I don't know what you mean. Anna's shy. She's always been like this. Shadow shifted, nails scraping lightly against the floor. A low growl rumbled from his chest. Marcus swallowed hard, eyes darting. The excuses that had once sustained him faltered under the weight of man and dog alike. Daniel's voice cut through the silence. We've seen the drawings, the attendance records, the way she trembles when you leave. You can deny it, but the truth is staring at you right now. Marcus's chest heaved. His shoulders sagged, his defenses crumbling. I didn't mean. I was stressed. The bills. Losing my job. I drank. The words broke into fragments. Shadow leaned forward, silent but unrelenting. Marcus's eyes flicked toward him, then back to Daniel. Something cracked. He slumped forward, voice trembling. I lost control. I hit her. Not always, not every time, but when I was angry. Daniel's jaw tightened, though his tone stayed measured. You chose anger over your daughter. Every time, you had a choice. Marcus sobbed openly now, tears streaking his pale face. I thought she'd forgive me. I didn't know how else to stop myself. Daniel's voice lowered, steady but sharp. She didn't need forgiveness, Marcus. She needed protection. And you failed. Shadow's tail brushed the floor once, deliberate, like a judge's gavel. Marcus's shoulders shook violently. I was wrong. I failed her. Completely. The silence afterward was suffocating. For the first time, Marcus had nothing left to hide behind. Down the hall, the precinct hummed with quiet activity. Radios crackling, phones ringing. Daniel sat at a conference table, files spread before him. Shadow lay at his feet, steady as ever. The charges waited. Child abuse, neglect, endangerment. Words on paper heavy with consequence, yet Daniel knew no ink could measure the nights Anna had spent crying in silence. Sarah, the social worker, entered with her own file. Her calm eyes carried the weight of what came next. Healing, not just paperwork. Daniel nodded. They both understood. Law could punish, but only patience and care could rebuild a child. 2 officers escorted Marcus past, his cuffs clicking. He avoided Daniel's eyes, face pale with resignation. Shadow rose slightly, a quiet growl in his chest, enough to remind Marcus that accountability had teeth. Daniel stood, papers in hand. His voice was steady, deliberate. Marcus Hale, you are formally charged with child abuse, neglect, and endangerment. You will have no contact with the victim. Marcus flinched, lips trembling, but Daniel pressed on. The law will do what you would not. Anna will be protected. The words landed like steel. Marcus's knuckles whitened against the cuffs, but the fight in him was gone. Later, Daniel signed the final pages. His mind wasn't on the ink. It was on Anna. The small hand tangled in Shadow's fur, the tentative trust of a child leaning on a dog for safety. Justice could restrain Marcus, but healing would be slower, quieter. He remembered her drawings, the walls covered with silent cries for help. The law could name the crime, but it could not erase what she had lived through. That work belonged to patience, to presence, to Shadow. Marcus was led away, muttering broken apologies that dissolved into the sterile air. Daniel didn't look up. His focus was already on Anna, on the weeks ahead. Shadow nudged his hand, amber eyes steady. Daniel rested his palm on the shepherd's back. Together, they would guard the fragile threads of recovery. Justice had been served. Now came the healing. And in that moment, the room, once heavy with lies and excuses, carried something new. A fragile possibility, a child safe, a promise defended, and a dog whose silent vigilance would ensure Anna never trembled alone again. The safe house was alive with laughter, games, and the hum of children reclaiming pieces of their lives. But in one quiet corner, Anna sat curled in on herself, dark eyes watching, but never joining. No one pressed her. Social workers knew silence was its own language. Trust could not be rushed. Shadow stayed close, his body a living shield. When she shifted, he shifted. When her fingers trembled, he brushed against her arm, a steady presence reminding her that here, at least, she was safe. Her drawings were still dark. Jagged shapes, twisted figures, cryptic symbols, silent testimonies of fear. The staff left them untouched. For now, presence mattered more than questions. Meals were rituals of patience. Anna barely ate, tracing her plate more than touching food. Shadow sat beside her, eyes steady. When she dared, she let her hand rest on his back, and somehow that was enough. Daniel visited daily. He noticed what others might miss. The twitch of her fingers toward a crayon, the faintest exhale, the way she allowed Shadow to rest his head in her lap. Victories, measured in breaths, not words. Outside, children played in the sunlight. Anna clung to her blanket at the edge of the garden. Shadow mirrored her, ear flicking at every shout. Once, she tilted her face toward the light. For Daniel, that was enough hope. At night, she pressed her face into Shadow's fur, his heartbeat guiding hers until sleep came. These were her first nights of safety, even if fear still lingered in the dark. Days passed like this, silent, observant, cautious. Then, one morning in the art room, sunlight spilled across cluttered tables. Children drew with abandon, laughter brightening the air. Anna sat apart, clutching her pencil. Her paper, as always, was filled with dark swirls. But today, something shifted. Shadow nudged her hand gently, tail tapping. She blinked, then pressed her pencil down. A circle took shape, uneven, imperfect. A sun. Whispers rippled through the children, but no one teased. Daniel, watching from the doorway, felt his chest ache. For the first time, Anna had drawn light. Shadow nudged again, firmer. Her lips twitched, the faintest smile. Sarah knelt nearby, voice soft. "That's beautiful, Anna." Anna hesitated, then drew rays around the circle, uneven but deliberate. When she reached for a yellow crayon, her fingers shook, but she pressed color into the page. Shadow rested his head on her lap. This time, Anna giggled softly. It was a sound foreign, fragile, but real. The next morning, Anna sat on her bed, Shadow's head on her knee. Sarah entered quietly with milk and biscuits, sitting a respectful distance away. She waited. Patience had always been the rule. Anna clutched her blanket tight. For days she had drawn, smiled faintly, even laughed once, but words remained locked away. Shadow nudged her hand again, steady as always. Anna's lips parted. A whisper slipped out, trembling, but clear. "I don't want to go back." Shadow's ears pricked, eyes fixed on her. Sarah's breath caught. She leaned forward, voice gentle. "You don't have to, sweetheart. Not now. Not ever. You're safe here." Anna's fingers dug into Shadow's fur. Tears shimmered, but she held them back, her body trembling with relief. From the doorway, Daniel exhaled slowly. He had seen many rescues, many children locked in silence. But this, a whisper breaking through, a child claiming her right to safety, was the real victory. Shadow pressed closer, his body anchoring hers. Sarah brushed a lock of hair from Anna's face, murmuring, "Every word is a step forward. Your voice matters." For the first time, Anna nodded. Not much, not bold, but enough. Shadow's tail tapped the floor, slow and steady, keeping rhythm with her fragile courage. The sun through the curtains glowed brighter, painting her cheek in soft light. And Daniel knew. Justice had removed the threat, but healing had truly begun here, in the whisper of a child, the patience of a guardian, and the quiet strength of a dog who would never leave her side. The morning air was crisp, pine-scented, as Daniel pulled up the gravel drive to the safe house. Shadow leapt from the car, tail wagging, sensing the anticipation in his partner's steps. The modest building glowed in the sunlight, flowers blooming in the windows, a picture of healing. The door opened before Daniel could knock. Anna stood there, her frame small, but her eyes brighter than weeks ago. She stepped aside silently, Shadow brushing past her like an old friend. Inside, the walls were lined with children's artwork. Bright houses and gardens, so unlike Anna's early jagged sketches. By the window, her newest drawing caught Daniel's eye. A house filled with light, smoke curling from the chimney, a tree standing tall beside it. "I drew it," Anna whispered. Her voice was steadier now. Daniel knelt. "It's beautiful. A safe home." Her lips trembled, then firmed. "It's a house where no one yells." Shadow nudged her hand, and she buried her fingers in his fur. Daniel swallowed hard, emotion rising. For the first time, hope felt real. "Do you want to see the garden?" she asked. "I'd love to." Outside, the sun lit golden flowers swaying in the breeze. Anna touched a sunflower gently, reverently. "This is for you," she said, holding up the drawing again. "So you remember. It's possible." Daniel's chest tightened. "I'll remember, Anna. Every day." Days later, in the art room, sunlight streamed across tables scattered with crayons and paper. Children trickled in, some clutching toys, others hesitant. Anna sat apart, Shadow at her side. A boy named Liam offered her colored pencils. "Do you want some?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Thank you." It was small, but for Anna, monumental. She began to draw. A garden, flowers stretching toward the sun. At its center, a figure of herself, surrounded by a circle of color. Shadow nudged her hand, tail brushing the floor in quiet encouragement. Sarah, the social worker, crouched nearby. "That's beautiful, Anna. What's it about?" Anna's voice wavered, then strengthened. "It's a garden where no one yells, and everyone can stay." The other children began to share. Gardens, pets, safe places. Marco added, "I have a dog too." Laughter and murmurs rippled, a fragile thread weaving between them all. Anna lifted her hand again, braver now. "My garden has a big dog. He keeps everyone safe." The children nodded. Shadow nudged her shoulder, tail wagging. For the first time, she was part of the group. One quiet afternoon, Anna drew again. This time, the figures were unmistakable: herself, Daniel, and Shadow. The lines trembled but were sure. Daniel's smile, Shadow's steady eyes, her own small frame between them. When she finished, she whispered, "This is my real family now." Daniel blinked against the sting in his eyes. He crouched beside her. "That's right, Anna. Family is built on trust and love. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Shadow rested his head in her lap, tail wagging softly. Anna stroked his fur, her lips curving into a smile that carried warmth, not just survival. Sarah approached quietly. "Can you tell me who everyone is?" Anna pointed. "Me, Daniel, Shadow. They keep me safe. They're my family." The words hung in the sunlight. Fragile, but powerful. For weeks she had been silent. Now she claimed her place, her belonging. Daniel brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I'm proud of you, Anna. We'll keep taking steps together as a family." She placed the drawing against the wall to dry, its colors catching the light like a promise. Shadow thumped his tail. Daniel's hand rested on her shoulder, and Anna sat between them, a small figure radiating resilience. For the first time in her young life, she understood what it meant to be safe, to be seen, and to belong. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and aged stone, a faint tang of disinfectant lingering in the air. The high ceilings and tall windows admitted streams of harsh midday light, cutting across rows of wooden benches and bouncing off the brass fixtures that lined the judge's bench. The room was silent, but it was a loaded silence, heavy with expectation, with the weight of past trauma, with the quiet judgment of everyone who had gathered to witness the day's proceedings. Daniel sat near the back, Shadow obediently at his side, his massive frame pressing calmly against Daniel's leg. Despite the chaos that had defined the weeks before, the frantic calls, the rescue, the nights spent in vigil, today there was a stillness that demanded observation. Not observation of evidence or testimony, but of resolution. The kind of resolution that was rarely neat, often never fully satisfying, yet necessary. Anna sat a few rows ahead, hand in hand with Sarah, her small fingers curled tightly around the social worker's. She had dressed neatly, her hair brushed, a ribbon tying back stray strands, a subtle mark of care and hope in a life long denied both. Shadow's head rested lightly against her chair, a constant grounding presence. The gallery was sparse. Only those whose roles demanded presence were seated, yet the weight of the room made every chair feel occupied. The attorneys, their papers and notes arrayed like shields, moved with precise motions, their faces betraying nothing. Marcus, shackled, entered with a measured gait. His eyes darted nervously, the edges rimmed red from sleepless nights, or perhaps from the realization that no words, no feigned excuses could untangle the consequences of his actions. His handcuffs clinked faintly with every step, a sound that seemed to echo and settle into the very walls around them. Daniel's eyes, trained to read both body language and the quiet, telling signs of emotion, watched Marcus with a measured restraint. He did not feel triumph, nor the shallow satisfaction of seeing someone punished. Instead, he focused on closure, not for himself, not for the system, but for Anna. He remembered the countless nights she had spent silent, frozen, her eyes reflecting fears too vast to name. He thought of the art she had drawn, the whispered words she had finally spoken, and the slow, fragile smiles that had begun to brighten her days. This courtroom, these formalities, were the last barrier between the shadows of her past and the dawn she deserved. The judge entered, robes flowing, a presence both authoritative and impartial. Marcus's attorney murmured something before the judge's voice rang out, firm and deliberate. Marcus Reinhardt, after consideration of the evidence, testimonies, and the circumstances of your actions, the court finds you guilty of child abuse, neglect, and endangerment. You are hereby sentenced to 20 years in state prison. The words fell into the room like a gavel striking steel. Marcus's face paled, then flushed, lips parting in a silent, stammering protest. Shadow's low, unwavering growl cut through the air, not aggressive, but a reminder that justice had weight beyond words. Daniel did not look at Marcus. He did not need to. The system had spoken, and while it could not undo the scars, it could enforce boundaries that ensured Anna's safety. Anna shifted slightly in her seat, instinctively leaning closer to Sarah. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her eyes, however, were wide and clear, tracking the scene with an understanding far beyond her years. She glimpsed the man who had caused her pain, now restrained, now accountable, and in that moment she felt a sense of separation from the fear that had once consumed her. Shadow nudged her hand gently, tail swishing, a living tether to calm and protection. The dog's presence, steady and silent, seemed to amplify the room's symbolic resonance. The cycle of abuse had been halted, boundaries enforced, safety restored. Daniel's mind wandered briefly to the countless similar cases he had witnessed, each different, each devastating in its own way. He had seen punishment meted out countless times, and yet few instances offered the clarity of a life tangibly changed. Here, today, he felt that clarity. Justice, in its procedural form, could never fully mend what had been broken, but it could enforce the reality that harm had limits, that accountability existed, and that a child could begin to rebuild without constant fear. Marcus's protests faded, drowned out by the procedural authority of the court. He lowered his head, shoulders slumping, the reality of confinement settling like a weight upon him. No longer could he threaten, intimidate, or manipulate. No longer could his hands reach out to harm. For Anna, and for every other child like her, the world outside those walls had regained the right to be safe. Daniel finally allowed his eyes to flick to Anna, noticing the faint, almost imperceptible curl of her lips. A quiet acknowledgement of the ending of one chapter, the promise of another. Shadow rested his head across her lap, and she placed a tentative hand on his fur. The connection between them was unspoken yet complete. Safety, trust, and the first real sense of family, reinforced in a moment of shared understanding. The sentence was brief, the ceremony formal, yet its significance resonated far beyond the walls of the courtroom. It was a pivot point, not a solution, not a cure, but a bridge. For Marcus, it was confinement. For Anna, it was freedom. For Daniel, a quiet reassurance that the work, painful as it had been, had led to something meaningful. As the bailiff motioned for Marcus to be taken away, Daniel rose slowly, Shadow at his side. He walked toward Anna, who reached for his hand without hesitation, a gesture that symbolized trust, resilience, and the quiet triumph of connection over fear. Outside, sunlight flooded the courthouse steps, and Daniel felt the weight of the day shift, a subtle but profound easing, as if the world had briefly aligned with justice and hope. Anna glanced at the steps, at the figures disappearing behind the security doors, then back to Daniel and Shadow. Her eyes carried a new certainty, a small flame of hope and strength that could not be dimmed by the shadows of yesterday. The courthouse, a place of finality and reckoning, had also become a landmark on her journey toward healing. A reminder that the cycle had been broken, and that the possibility of normalcy, of safety, and of trust could now grow. Shadow nudged her again, a gentle, grounding pressure. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. The three of them stood there together, silent but united, a triangle of protection, resilience, and healing. The weight of the past lingered, but for the first time in years, it was no longer a chain, only a shadow fading behind the light of a new beginning. And in that moment, Daniel realized that while justice could punish, it was connection, care, and unwavering presence, embodied in the quiet insistence of a German shepherd at a child's side, that truly healed. Anna's real family, one she had chosen and claimed through trust and shared moments, had been quietly forged. The courthouse doors opened to a world waiting to be reclaimed, and together they stepped forward, leaving behind fear, embracing the fragile, luminous promise of a new life. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the wide open windows of the safe house, painting warm streaks of gold across the pale walls. The once dim dormitory now glimmered with a quiet, welcoming energy, the light bouncing off polished floors and the corners of carefully arranged furniture. It was a morning unlike any Anna had experienced in recent memory, one that carried with it the subtle promise of safety, of freedom, of normalcy. Anna stirred beneath her blanket, the gentle warmth coaxing her eyes open. For a moment she hesitated, the residual unease of countless sleepless nights tugging at the edges of her consciousness. But then, the soft rustle of Shadow's paws across the floor reminded her that she was not alone, that she was protected. The German shepherd rested on the small rug beside her bed, head lowered but eyes alert, tail flicking ever so slightly as if to urge her into the day. A comforting weight of presence that required no words. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, bare feet touching the cool wooden floor, and instinctively reached down to stroke Shadow's fur. The soft, dense coat yielded to her fingers like a living cushion, and a small, tentative smile curled at the corners of her mouth. It was subtle, nearly imperceptible to anyone not paying close attention, yet for Daniel, who had arrived moments earlier, it was a victory. He watched from the doorway, hands casually tucked into his jacket pockets, shadowed by the morning light, feeling a cautious relief rise in his chest. The rigid tension of the past weeks had not completely dissolved, but in this small smile, he could see the first tangible sign of genuine joy. The safe house was waking. In the hallway, the sounds of other children stirring filtered in, the quiet shuffle of slippers across floorboards, low murmurs of sleepy voices, the faint creak of doors opening and closing. Anna felt a flutter in her chest, a nervous but exhilarating pull toward the unknown. The day ahead, unmarked by fear, unshackled by past trauma. Shadow nudged her gently with his snout, tail wagging in slow, deliberate arcs, a clear invitation to step into this new rhythm. Anna rose fully now, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. She paused for a moment at the doorway, sunlight spilling across her small frame, illuminating the subtle freckles along her nose and cheeks. Then, almost impulsively, she bolted. Her bare feet pattered across the polished hallway, down the steps and through the door that led to the yard outside. Daniel called after her softly, but he did not rush. He did not need to. This was her moment, the first unrestrained, unguarded motion she had allowed herself since arriving. Outside, the courtyard of the safe house was alive with movement. Children of all ages ran and laughed, their voices carrying freely through the crisp morning air. Swings swayed gently, slides glinted in the sunlight, and small clusters of children played together, tentative alliances forming naturally, as if instinctively understanding that this was a space where they could be free. Anna paused for a heartbeat at the edge, absorbing the scene. Then, with a deep, unspoken exhale, she ran forward, joining in. Shadow was at her side instantly, muscles coiled and ready, yet his demeanor remained gentle. He bounded alongside her, ears pricked, tail sweeping in long, joyous arcs. The contrast between the dog's energy and the residual shadows in Anna's mind was stark. He leapt over puddles, swerved around flower beds, and barked once, low and exuberant, as if to announce, "This is safe, this is yours, this is ours." Anna laughed, a sound so light and pure it seemed to make the morning itself pause. She ran freely, arms outstretched, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she did not look over her shoulder. A group of children noticed her and called out, welcoming her into a game of tag. Tentatively at first, she joined, laughing when Shadow chased after her with exaggerated playful bounds, nudging anyone who came too close with careful enthusiasm. The social interactions that once would have terrified her now unfolded with surprising ease. Even when another child's hand brushed against hers, there was no instinctive recoil, only curiosity, a desire to connect. Daniel remained on the sidelines, shadowed by the tall oaks that lined the courtyard, observing without intruding. He felt the weight of the past cases, the silent victories and quiet tragedies. But this scene of sunlight, laughter, and gentle camaraderie offered a kind of solace he rarely allowed himself to savor. He noticed the subtle details. Anna's hair bouncing in the sunlight, Shadow's fur catching the golden rays, the way her small body moved with a freedom previously unimaginable. As the morning unfolded, Anna's confidence grew in incremental, almost imperceptible ways. She spoke to another girl for the first time, words emerging softly. "Want to play?" The words, so simple yet so monumental, were met with an eager nod and a shared giggle. Shadow barked once, short and approving, nudging Anna's hand as if to say, "This is what you've been waiting for." At breakfast later, Anna sat at a long wooden table with several of the other children, the sunlight spilling across plates of scrambled eggs and toast. She reached for food without hesitation, poured herself a small glass of juice, and even offered Shadow a piece of bread, a small gesture of companionship, of shared life. For Daniel, watching from nearby, the sight was almost overwhelming in its significance. Every moment of fear, every tear, every restless night had led to this. A child reclaiming a simple, fundamental right to feel safe, to feel normal, to feel joy. The morning carried on in this way, tentative interactions blossoming into laughter, careful steps turning into confident strides. Shadow remained ever present, a bridge between Anna's inner world and the outside reality, a living emblem of protection and trust. When she tripped, he was there to steady her. When she laughed too loudly and glanced around, he mirrored her energy without overwhelming her. As the sunlight grew stronger, Anna paused in the center of the yard, taking in the full panorama of movement, color, and life. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes, letting the warmth wash over her, letting the sensation of freedom sink in. The courtyard, once just a place, now became a symbol, a living, breathing affirmation that the past could not define the future. Daniel approached finally, crouching to meet her gaze. "Feeling okay?" he asked softly. Anna nodded, words not yet necessary. Shadow nudged her hand, and she laughed again, the sound ringing across the yard like a bell of newfound hope. It was a morning that promised more mornings, a day that promised days, a life that promised, finally, the beginnings of healing. The shadows of the past had not disappeared entirely, but for the first time, they did not dominate. The sunlight, laughter, and companionship filled the spaces they once occupied, leaving room for trust, for growth, and for the small, profound moments that stitched together a childhood reclaimed. And in that brighter morning, with Shadow at her side and Daniel quietly observing, Anna began to understand something she had never dared to hope. That this world, chaotic and unpredictable as it was, could also be hers to explore, to inhabit, and to cherish. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the safe house courtyard. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of spring blossoms and freshly mown grass, and yet there was a gentle hush, a pause in the world that seemed to hold its breath in quiet witness. Daniel and Shadow stood slightly apart from the cluster of children playing, a respectful distance that allowed Anna her freedom while still keeping her tethered to safety. Anna's laughter rang out across the yard, bright and unrestrained, a sound that seemed to carry years of sorrow in its absence. It was unpolished, raw, yet filled with an authenticity that made Daniel's chest tighten with a mix of relief and bittersweet memory. She ran across the grass, arms outstretched, spinning in wide circles as Shadow trotted beside her, ears perked, tail wagging in steady, jubilant arcs. Every movement spoke of freedom regained, of a trust cautiously rebuilt, of the delicate reclamation of a childhood once stolen. From his vantage point, Daniel observed the transformation in subtle details, the way Anna's shoulders lifted as she ran, unburdened by the constant tension she once carried, the tilt of her head as she noticed another child joining in her game, the fleeting glances she cast toward the sky, as if measuring the vastness of her new world. She still bore the faint, indelible marks of trauma, a pause here, a wary step there, but those moments were no longer the defining pattern of her days. They existed as remnants, acknowledged and witnessed, yet no longer all-consuming. Shadow stayed steadfastly at her side, sometimes a step behind, sometimes leaping ahead to playfully intercept her. He was the living embodiment of loyalty, a silent guardian whose presence allowed Anna the courage to take her first, unguarded steps into joy. His dark coat gleamed in the sunlight, eyes bright and intelligent, alert to every movement, every sound. Yet there was an ease to him now, a calm confidence born not from command, but from mutual understanding. Anna knew she could trust him, rely on him, and in that trust, she found the courage to venture further than she ever had in the confines of fear. Daniel shifted his weight, resting one hand on Shadow's thick shoulder. The German shepherd leaned subtly into him, head slightly lowered, ears twitching, as if acknowledging the unspoken reflections shared between human and dog. Daniel's eyes never left Anna. He watched her weave through the other children, offering smiles, tentative words, and gestures of kindness that had been unthinkable only months before. Each small interaction was a victory, each shared laugh a step toward reclaiming the life she deserved. He thought back to the long months of investigations, the tense raids, the courtroom battles, the silent nights spent standing vigil by a frightened child's bedside. The darkness he had confronted was real, harsh, unyielding. Yet here, in this courtyard bathed in golden light, it seemed almost distant, almost softened by the persistence of healing. He recognized that justice alone, arrests, charges, convictions, could not erase the scars. It could not replace the stolen laughter, the hours lost to fear. But witnessing Anna's resilience, her small but profound reclamation of agency, offered a different kind of closure, a reminder that even in the aftermath of trauma, hope could root itself in human connection and unspoken loyalty. Anna paused mid-run, crouching to adjust her shoes, and looked around at the children playing. Her gaze lingered on a boy whose nervous energy mirrored her own initial trepidation. Tentatively, she offered him a hand, which he accepted with a shy smile. They ran together, Shadow bounding beside them, a bridge between the tentative beginnings of friendship and the unspoken reassurance of protection. Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat at the scene, a tableau of resilience that spoke louder than any report or testimony ever could. The courtyard hummed with life, shouts of delight, the rhythmic squeak of swings, the low murmur of conversations newly formed. Anna's world was expanding, a delicate mosaic of trust, connection, and self-expression. And yet it was anchored by two constants: Daniel, whose presence offered unwavering stability, and Shadow, whose loyalty formed a tangible, living buffer against the lingering shadows of her past. Together, they were the pillars supporting the fragile architecture of her renewed sense of security. Daniel allowed himself a slow, steady breath. He let the warmth of the sunlight wash over him, the comforting weight of Shadow at his side, and the vibrant, chaotic life of the children unfold before his eyes. He thought of the countless nights he had spent wrestling with the darkness he had encountered in his line of work, the lingering doubts and sleepless hours questioning whether anyone could truly heal from such wounds. And yet, here it was, undeniable, irrefutable, and beautifully fragile. The evidence that hope was not only possible, it was tangible, alive in laughter, in play, in small gestures of trust and joy. Anna stumbled slightly over a small root, and Shadow darted forward, nudging her gently with his snout, steadying her without interrupting her momentum. She laughed, brushing dirt from her knees, and turned to wave at Daniel, a small but intentional acknowledgement of the adults who had stood with her, who had held the line until she could find her own strength. It was not a look of dependence, but one of recognition, a subtle nod to the continuum of care, protection, and love that had brought her to this moment. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, the shadows grew longer, stretching across the yard like soft fingers. Yet these were not the shadows of fear or threat. They were simply the natural, gentle reminders of the passing day. Anna chased after a ball, calling out for another child to join, and in that call, Daniel heard not desperation, not pleading, but a courageous assertion of agency. She was present. She was engaged. She was choosing life over fear, joy over silence. For a long moment, Daniel and Shadow stood in quiet observation, two figures cast in the amber light of afternoon, watching the culmination of months of struggle, pain, and incremental victories. And in that quiet vigil, he allowed himself to hope, truly hope, that the lessons of resilience, trust, and courage Anna had absorbed would carry her far beyond the walls of the safe house, far beyond the shadows that had once sought to claim her. In the quiet loyalty of a dog and the courage of a child, he thought, hope had found a home again. And for Daniel, Shadow, and Anna, that home was not a place, but a living, breathing space defined by connection, safety, and the unshakable certainty that even in the wake of trauma, the dawn of a brighter tomorrow was always possible. Watching Anna's journey, it's impossible not to feel the quiet, steadfast power of a loyal companion. German Shepherds have a way of anchoring us, of offering safety, comfort, and unconditional love when the world feels too heavy. Shadow wasn't just a protector. He was a bridge between fear and trust, teaching a frightened child that connection can heal even the deepest wounds. There's something profoundly human about the bond we share with animals. The way they meet us without judgment, how their presence alone can calm a racing heart, and how their loyalty quietly reminds us that we are never truly alone. If you've ever felt the gentle pull of your dog's companionship and wondered how to deepen that connection, there are wonderful resources that offer simple ways to strengthen the trust and understanding between you and your furry friend. I found this one really heartfelt and easy to explore, and it's given me new ways to appreciate the little moments I share with my own dog. Sometimes the smallest gestures, a touch, a look, a shared walk, become the moments that matter most. I hope you'll take a little time to notice them today.